Hello and welcome to episode 30 of The Climate Skeptic. I'm your host, Laurie Wastel, an associate editor at the Daily Skeptic. And I'm very pleased to be joined today by Ben Pyle, who is a journalist and Daily Skeptic regular. Welcome back, Ben.
Thanks for having me back, Laurie.
Yeah, very good to have you here. And, a few things to get into today, but one story that is from, a few weeks ago now, but I think it is very, very interesting, very telling, actually, about the way things are going and the way that even the laggardly, sleepy mainstream media are waking up to some of the consequences of the disastrous net zero narrative that they, in fact, have been pushing for such a long time. You identified this documentary that came out from Sky News not long ago, which, who would have guessed it, Ben, found that in the present day, British industry is really struggling, and it might have something to do with our energy costs. So, tell us a bit about that documentary, what did you make of it?
Well, this was a 20-minute short documentary from Ed Conway of Sky, and I don't want to be too hard on the guy. I do, but a lot of my colleagues remind me, there's more joy in heaven and all that. And so we have to sort of take these kind of things in good grace. But Sky itself, we'll come on to the film, but Sky itself, as part of a group of news agencies, mostly in the UK, the BBC, Channel 4 News and ITV, are part of an organisation that pledged to use their power as news broadcasters and journalistic enterprises to advance the green agenda. And they said, not just in their news output, but that's where we're concerned about this. They sort of essentially made themselves political parties, as in parties to the political process, not parties you can vote for, and signed pledges to that effect. So it's been quite remarkable that now they are almost confronted with the fruits of their labours and the results of this kind of what you might call a cartel of sorts to dominate the media narrative. It's all the more annoying because it's the kind of stuff that skeptics, including myself, but not, of course, just myself, have been pointing out for decades. This is going to be the consequence, that industrial sites, industrial enterprises are not going to be able to continue to compete with rising energy prices. And that's all very well and good saying you'd rather these industries were green, but that may not be physically or chemically, materially possible. Yet that was the orders of the political, of the policy agenda, that we would incrementally decarbonize the economy. And the belief was that through economic incentives and punishment, eventually efficiencies would be found such that industry would be able to completely decarbonize it and make itself green. But no one ever really stopped to ask whether that was possible, right? That not even the politicians who enacted that legislation, and certainly not the lobby that encouraged those politicians to do that. And now, of course, Sky produces this documentary revealing that the problem is high energy prices. Now, unfortunately, over 20 minutes, there is only this point about energy prices is only touched upon twice. Now, Ed Conway goes and visits an old industrial estate, an old INEOS industrial estate, which is one of the largest chemical plants, apparently in Europe, according to the documentary. Now, and this is pretty much a tour of a graveyard of British industry. He talks about all the stuff that used to be there but is no longer, and rather than really sort of picking apart how this happened, going back to the 1990s and the 2000s when this stuff was this policy agenda was launched, and looking at the history of that agenda and who was lobbying who, it's a sort of almost haunting retrospective of our former glories without any really difficult questions asking. And of course, part of the deal that Sky News has sort of entered into with BBC and Channel 4 is to not allow people such as yours truly or any other climate skeptic or onto the airwaves, right? So we could have had 20 years of discussion about this, but now the news agenda is 20 years behind. So the explanations are going to be another 20 years or so in the making, and of course they're not going to ask themselves any difficult questions. They're not going to say, what were we doing? I think Ed the producer of the section, actually understands a lot of this. He's done some quite good sort of analyses of the economics of the economics that we're now confronting, and the loss of industries, in particular the chemicals industry. Complete with lots of graphs and everything. But I think he's probably still held back by, at the very least, the political culture that exists within those broadcasters. Now, if those broadcasters were to suddenly find their journalistic curiosity, we might suddenly see a rush of this kind of stuff. But who are they going to approach? Who are they going to ask? Who's on their Rolodexes? Interesting dialogues between Sky News anchors and participants have occurred over those decades. I'm not saying it's been a complete desert. Some interesting people have been allowed on, but they are few and far between. Far more likely, what you're going to get is someone from Extinction Rebellion having quite a testy argument with a Sky News representative about whether or not their campaigns are going to be effective. But we need a far more dynamic and far more confrontational news media that's really able to challenge Ed Miliband, to challenge the government's green agenda, and to challenge all of the lobbying organizations, of which there is a constellation that have created this, and to challenge their own executives. So this 20-minute film, I think, fails in many respects to really make much of a dent and impression. And we all know now that the policy agenda is misplaced, misdirected. What we really need to do is to start interrogating the politics of this, not just the policies, the politics, and that means including the ideology of that stuff. So I make that distinction.
Well, absolutely, Ben. I mean, on that, it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, this is ostensibly a documentary by a political channel about a very important political issue, and you would expect, as you say, there to be a little bit more curiosity then, and then to be a little bit more than just, oh, well, that's interesting. Now, our key industry is sort of crumbling into dust. Why might that be happening? And to dig a bit more deeply into, as you say, think about the ideologies behind it, think about who has pushed this, and lay some political blame, perhaps, and then really to think about the broad problems we face today in terms of structural issues that have gone on for 20 years or more, whereas the sort of fly-by-night, very surface level way that many of these mainstream journalists approach this is just sort of, well, that's funny, isn't it? Our energy prices are slightly high, and to think almost nothing more of it. So it's a sort of indictment in a way of that class of political journalists.
Well, I think that's true, and I mean the green agenda in its its current form pretty much began. I mean, before I was even born. I mean, in 1972 was the first United Nations conference on the environment in Stockholm, and it was around that time. I mean, very little has changed. The ideology and the political agenda hasn't developed very much since then, and all of the claims then are pretty much the claims now. The major difference is merely in messaging. But if you go back to that time when this political policy agenda was being developed, you can see the DNA of what we have now, and what's turned into an organism, if you like. And in that DNA, it's very clear that they believed that economic growth had reached its maximum. That was the hypothesis was called the limits to growth, that was championed by think tanks, international think tanks, particularly the Club of Rome, and it was brought straight into the UN's agenda on this topic. And they said economic growth has got to be restricted because there is this tension between the natural world and industry. And indeed wealth. So in fact, it was formulated by one of those academic researchers, scientists at the time, Paul Ehrlich, and he said that environmental impact equals population times affluence times technology, and that was the basis of his argument at the time against nuclear power, for example. So on that basis, the formula is called IPAT. And so he said that if you create cheap energy, cheap and affordable energy, then what will happen is more environmental destruction. Now, because of that formula. Now, of course, it's not true. If you actually have cheap energy, then you actually manage to very significantly reduce your ecological footprint, or at least your physical footprint. So you can leave much more of the land and the seas to nature. I mean, just look at a wind farm. It's extremely extensive. It's in the order of 1,000 times a greater footprint than any conventional form of generating energy, right? So it was always on these flawed premises that the green agenda rolled forward. So. Well, what I'm getting at is that there was an anti-growth agenda. There was an anti-growth, anti-industrial agenda that rolled on. Somehow, at some point, the green blob, as it were, became better at selling itself, and it sold itself on the idea that you could have green growth within that framework. And that just meant that you had to have wind turbines instead of nuclear power stations, coal-fired power stations, and gas-fired power stations. But as we can see, that has failed. Now, if I was going to make a documentary for Sky, I'm making a documentary on this subject. But if I was going to make it for Sky, I would take it back to that point and say, this is when green ideology began influencing British policy making, British industrial policy, British economic policy, and so on and so forth. And the problem is, it has never been confronted in any meaningful sense as it's gone up the political agenda. News organisations, British news organisations, are far too close to the British government, and perhaps we could say the establishment, and they don't seem capable or willing to challenge that ideology. And it's very clear. I mean, if you didn't know that we had a problem with an ideological movement when people started blocking roads, gluing themselves to trains, smashing windows, then there's no hope for you to accept in any form that there is a need to confront this bizarre ideology. And unfortunately, I think Sky were kind of instrumental in letting us down in that way.
Okay, and so in terms of the grand ideologies of the global elites, then we are, it seems, entering a period of some glasnost, as it were. And the example that you pointed to recently that's really rather interesting is Mark Carney, Prime Minister of Canada's speech to the World Economic Forum at Davos last month. And, well, he wasn't taking aim strictly at green ideology there, and perhaps he should have been, as you've argued, but he was taking aim at the fictions of the rules-based international order, which was interesting in and of itself. But, Ben, did he go far enough?
It was an amazing revelation, I suppose, of sorts. I don't think he was expecting anyone outside of Davos to pay it very much attention. And I think he was intent on flattering that audience. And his conceit, I suppose you could call it, was that they were the put upon Eastern Europeans. He cites Václav Havel, the Czech dissident, who said how shopkeepers in the Soviet bloc used to put posters in their windows saying "Workers of the world unite." had no real interest in that ethic, that slogan, but they did it to keep the local authorities off their